A loud slap echoed through the police station. The room fell silent. The officer's chest swelled with authority as he towered over the teenager, his face twisted with contempt. "You think you can talk to me like that? You are nothing." The boy's head snapped to the side, his cheek stinging, but his eyes never wavered. He slowly turned back, his jaw tightening, his breath controlled, a reaction too composed for someone in his position. The officer leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "What, cat got your tongue? You kids never learn." A murmur rose from the small crowd, other officers, and a few civilians, all frozen in place. Some turned away, uncomfortable. Others watched, intrigued. The boy remained still, his hands balled into fists behind his back. "I would like to make my phone call now," he said, his voice steady, cold. The officer laughed, short, harsh. "Oh, you would, huh? Do you want to call your mommy? Maybe she can come down here and cry for you." A beat of silence. Then the boy did something unexpected. He smirked. The officer's laughter died mid-chuckle. The boy lifted his chin slightly. "No," he said. "I need to call my law firm." The color drained from the officer's face. The room, once buzzing with whispers, was now completely still. Who was this kid? And why did he say my law firm? The officer's eyebrows knitted together, his grip tightening on his belt. "What did you just say?" The teenager did not blink. "I said, I need to call my law firm." His voice was measured, each word landing with precision. A scoff erupted from another officer in the room. "Listen to this kid. His law firm. You hear that, Morrison?" Sergeant Morrison, broad-shouldered, late 40s, the kind of man who enjoyed power, rolled his neck, then leaned in so close the boy could feel his breath. "You're in my station, in my custody. I ask the questions, and right now I do not care who you think you are." The teenager's eyes stayed locked on Morrison's, calm, controlled, unshaken. That confidence irritated the officer. It was wrong. Kids in holding cells were supposed to plead, cry, and break down. But this one? He sat on the metal chair, hands resting on the table, not a single tremor in his fingers. Morrison's lips curled. Time to break him. He grabbed the chair opposite the boy and dragged it across the concrete floor, the sharp screech bouncing off the station's grey walls. Civilians waiting nearby flinched. A younger officer swallowed hard, watching from the corner. Morrison sat down slowly, arms resting on the table, a sneer playing at the edge of his mouth. "All right, genius, let's pretend I believe you. What's your name?" The boy tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smirk returning. "I believe you have my wallet you can read." Morrison's nostrils flared. The officer beside him chuckled. "This one's got some nerve." Morrison yanked open the evidence bag and slapped the boy's wallet onto the table. He flipped it open, scanning the ID, then he stopped. A beat of silence. Then a shift, a subtle one. His shoulders stiffened, but he covered it fast, snapping the wallet shut before anyone noticed. The teenager's eyes flickered with recognition. He had seen that micro-reaction countless times. He knew what it meant. Morrison tossed the wallet back into the evidence bag like it was nothing, but the way his fingers lingered an extra second gave him away. The officer sitting beside him leaned in. "Well, what's his name?" Morrison exhaled through his nose. "Eric." He hesitated, then forced a smirk. "Eric Davis." The room reacted immediately. A few officers glanced at each other. One even straightened in his seat. Eric watched it all unfold with quiet amusement. Morrison knew exactly who he was now. Eric rested his chin on his hand. Is there a problem, Sergeant? Morrison's smile thinned. Not at all. He leaned back, acting unbothered, but his jaw clenched just slightly. The officer beside him frowned. Wait. Davis? That name sounds familiar. Morrison waved a dismissive hand. Coincidence? Eric's expression remained unreadable, but the slightest twitch at the corner of his lips gave away that he knew Morrison was lying through his teeth. The young officer in the corner was not convinced. He pulled out his phone, typing something quickly. A few seconds later, his eyes widened. The moment he looked up, Eric met his gaze. No words were exchanged, but the unspoken realization was loud. The tension in the room shifted, subtly but undeniably. Eric knew, Morrison knew, and now so did someone else. The game had begun. Morrison's fingers tapped against the metal table, his composure forced but cracking at the edges. So, Eric Davis. He let the name hang in the air, watching for any sign of weakness. You think you're special? Eric stayed still, unreadable. I think I have the right to a phone call. Morrison snorted. Oh, you do, huh? He leaned in, his voice lowering. You must think you're pretty smart, walking in here, acting like you're above the law. Eric's eyes sharpened, but his voice remained even. No one is above the law, not even you. A flicker of something crossed Morrison's face. Annoyance? Amusement? Or maybe something deeper? He masked it quickly. You know, Morrison said, his tone almost conversational. I see a lot of kids come through here. Mouthy ones, think they know everything. You want to guess what happens to them? Eric didn't blink. They get released when they haven't committed a crime. Morrison's jaw ticked. He turned to the officer beside him. Go ahead and process him. He's getting booked. Eric's eyebrow arched. For what charge? Morrison smiled. Disturbing the peace. A chuckle escaped Eric's lips. That's interesting, considering I was the one assaulted. He tilted his head. You sure you want to go that route, Sergeant? The room tensed. Morrison's smile faltered for just a breath, but he recovered fast. Take him. Two younger officers hesitated. Eric noticed. So did Morrison. That hesitation was small, almost imperceptible. But it was there. Morrison's patience thinned. What's the problem? He's a punk kid with a bad attitude. Get the cuffs on him. Still, the younger officer, Parker, according to his badge, didn't move. Instead, his fingers twitched toward his phone again. Eric caught it. So did Morrison. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring. Something you want to share, Officer Parker? Parker hesitated. His gaze flicked to Eric, then back to Morrison. Sir, I think we should double-check something first. Morrison's fists clenched under the table. Double-check what exactly? Parker swallowed. His name, Eric Davis. It, sounds familiar. Eric finally leaned back, settling comfortably in his chair. His calm demeanor was intentional, a deliberate counter to Morrison's growing frustration. Do you need me to spell it for you? Eric asked, his voice smooth, unbothered. Morrison's jaw locked. The power dynamic in the room had started to shift. Not fully, but enough. He wasn't losing, not yet, but he could feel the balance tilting. Morrison let out a slow breath, reeling his emotions back in. His next move had to be controlled and precise. He turned back to Parker. Fine, you want to check something? Go ahead, but while you're doing that, I'm booking him. He looked to the officer beside him. Cuffs, now. Eric didn't flinch as the cold metal snapped around his wrists, but he did notice something else. The way Parker's fingers were flying over his phone screen, the way another officer was quietly stepping back, looking uneasy, the way the tension in the air was no longer just between him and Morrison, but among the other officers too. And then Parker's phone screen locked. His eyes lifted. And this time, when he looked at Eric, his expression wasn't just recognition anymore. It was a shock. He swallowed hard. "Sergeant," his voice was quieter now, "I think you should see this." Morrison's patience snapped. "For crying out loud, what now?" Parker hesitated, then turned his phone around. Morrison's face drained of color. The headline on the screen was unmistakable. Eric Davis, the youngest legal prodigy in the country, wins another high-profile case. And underneath it, a picture of the same kid now sitting in front of him. Morrison's lungs seized. The room had shifted completely. The officers who had been snickering minutes ago were now dead silent. Eric watched it all. Every flicker of realization, every barely hidden glance between them. He had been here before. He knew this dance. Morrison's fingers flexed against the table. His mind was racing, calculating, scrambling. But Eric? He just smiled, a slow, knowing smile, because now Morrison knew exactly who he had just slapped, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. Morrison's fingers curled into a fist on the table. His mouth pressed into a thin line, but his jaw had locked completely. The tension in the room was suffocating now. The officers who had been amused minutes ago were stone still, their eyes flicking between Eric and their sergeant. Morrison knew what they were thinking. They had just handcuffed one of the most well-known legal prodigies in the country on false charges. The air shifted. Morrison tried to regain control. "All right, listen," Eric spoke first. "No!" One word, sharp, controlled, final. Morrison's nostrils flared. "Excuse me?" Eric tilted his head slightly, his gaze cool, dissecting Morrison like a specimen under glass. "I said no," he repeated, his tone even. "You do not get to talk first anymore." Morrison's throat bobbed. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple. Eric leaned forward, slowly. A deliberate movement. Morrison did not lean back, but Eric saw the way his fingers twitched, the way his knee bounced under the table. "Good." Eric's voice was quiet now, controlled, measured. "You put your hands on me." A flicker of something in Morrison's eyes, guilt, number fear. "You mocked me, you insulted me, you called me nothing." Eric's fingers tapped lightly against the metal table, an almost absent-minded rhythm. Tension coiled in the silence. And now, Eric's voice dropped just slightly, like a blade lowering to someone's throat. "Now you realize your mistake." Morrison's teeth gritted together. His chest rose and fell faster than before. Eric studied him, took his time. Then, just loud enough for Morrison to hear, he said it, the final crack in the foundation. "You're going to lose your badge." Morrison's eyes flashed with rage. "You little—" Moved to stand, but Eric lifted his cuffed hands, just slightly, stopping him mid-motion. "I would not do that," Eric murmured. Morrison froze. It was too late, and they both knew it. Eric glanced at Parker, still gripping his phone like it held dynamite. "How many views does it have now?" Eric asked, calmly. Morrison's stomach plummeted. Parker swallowed. His thumb hovered over the screen before he exhaled, looking up. His voice shook. It was posted 3 minutes ago. It's already at 30,000 views." Morrison's breath caught. His face drained of color. A ripple of hushed reactions from the officers, one of them even cursed under his breath. Eric sat back in his chair, composed, calculated, in complete control. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes? They had already won. Morrison's throat was so dry it burned. His tongue pressed to the roof of his mouth, trying to form words, trying to recover. Eric watched him struggle, watched the realization sink in real time. This was not just a mistake. This was career-ending. Morrison knew exactly how the public would see this. A veteran officer assaults and wrongfully detains a young black lawyer. The footage is already spreading. The department will have to respond. Morrison's lips parted as if he could say something. Fix something. Eric lifted a hand. Save it! Morrison clenched his jaw so tight it popped. Eric turned to Parker. Uncuff me. Parker did not hesitate. The metal clicked open, and Eric rubbed his wrists lightly before standing. He smoothed the wrinkles from his shirt. Morrison still sat there, stiff, unmoving, but his hands, they were trembling. Eric adjusted his sleeves. Now, he said, voice even. I am going to walk out of here. Morrison swallowed hard. And if you try to stop me? Eric held Morrison's gaze, his voice softer now. You already know what happens next. Silence. Morrison said nothing, did nothing, because now he had no power left. Eric took his time. He adjusted his cuffs, straightened his posture, ran a hand over his wrist where the handcuffs had dug into his skin. Morrison was still seated, his face ashen, his fingers twitching against the table. The confidence he had carried before. Gone. Eric exhaled slowly as if deciding whether or not to say what he wanted to say. Then with a quiet shake of his head, he turned to Parker. I assume I am free to go? Parker nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Sir. Not kid, not punk, not nothing. Sir. Eric took a step toward the door, but then he paused. Without turning back, he asked, What happens now? Silence. Then Parker cleared his throat, glancing at Morrison, who still had not moved. The department will investigate the footage. Eric hummed. Will they? Parker's lips pressed together. He knew what Eric meant. Would they really investigate? Or would they cover it up? Eric finally turned, but not to Morrison. He faced the other officers, the ones who had been laughing, watching. Some had enjoyed it, some had been uncomfortable. None had stepped in, until now. One of them, an older officer with greying hair, cleared his throat. It's already out there. His voice was gruff, unreadable. Too late to bury it. Eric let that sit for a moment before nodding. Good. He looked back at Morrison. And you? Morrison's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room. His voice cracked. Eric lifted a brow, waited, but Morrison had nothing left to say. Eric watched him for another beat, then simply returned to the door. I will see myself out. He walked through the precinct, past the silent officers, the waiting civilians, and the desk sergeant who now looked everywhere except at him. He stepped outside. The cold air hit him first, then the buzz of his phone. He pulled it from his pocket, the screen lit up with notifications. Hundreds, thousands. The story had already exploded. His firm had already messaged him. His name was already trending. His phone was already ringing. He let it ring. Eric Davis had all the time in the world. But Morrison? Morrison was still sitting in that room, staring at nothing, knowing his career, his reputation, his entire life was about to implode. Because the thing about power, it only works when people believe you still have it. And Morrison had lost that belief forever. What do you think? Did Morrison get what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping content, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you for watching.